Welcome, everyone. And today we have a very interesting guest, Chandran Nair, who's the founder and CEO of the Global Institute of Tomorrow, GIFT. He's known for his enthusiasm, his passion. He's got amazing views on practically all topics, but really some interesting things on sustainability and how to operate business in a way that is value driven. And you know, we've seen him everywhere. Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal quotes him, the New York Times, China Daily. He writes for an array of media outlets, BBC, CNN, NKH, Al Jazeera, CCTV, Bloomberg, and Channel News Asia. So here he is today. And today, Chandran, welcome to the show. Really happy to have you with us. Thanks for your presence.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Roshan.
It's an absolute pleasure. Every time I talk to you, you tweak something. There's some insight or there's some probing that causes some rethinking of things. And I think today we are here to discuss your book. Just the title itself gives me some amazement and goosebumps. I think Dismantling Global White Privilege: Equity for a Post-Western World. And you talk a lot in this book. I mean, just browsing through on the destructive influence of global white privilege and how that's so pervasive, and some suggestions on how to break down some of this power of white privilege. So tell us a bit about your book, what inspired you, why this topic at this point in time.
But very quickly, the first thing I want to say is, most people, I mean, yes, as you say, the title is a bit inflammatory. So, but that's how editors look at book titles, But very importantly, I want to start by saying that the book is not an anti-white or anti-Western book. People confuse these things sometimes and conflate them. A non-Western perspective of something that I see as a global harm does not mean I'm anti-white people or anti-Western. Now, the origins of the book, of course, as most people would probably conclude, arrived at already, was the killing of George Floyd. So someone like me who spent, 5 years in Africa during the anti-apartheid era, was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, etc. I watched that and I thought, well, that's a Black Lives Matter kind of issue in the United States, and it's a very important issue. But then within like a few months, a few weeks, it went global, as you know, it traveled to Europe, etc. And then it even traveled to other parts of the world. And I even saw people strangely wearing Black Lives Matter T-shirts in Hong Kong and parts of Asia. And much of it was sort of superficial understanding what was going on. And in the United States, that conversation is very specific to the context of the United States, which is a very complex but systemic issue. But the rest of the parts of the world, particularly in Europe, they were taking down statues, talking about history, etc. And at that point, I thought, well, people don't really get it, but because it's gone global now, maybe I should say something. And then a couple of people said, you got to write something. And I wrote something for the South China Morning Post. I'm basically saying that the issue of white privilege is not simply an American issue of angry Karens calling the police when they see a Black man walking towards them. It's much more complex. And it's perhaps less emotive, but it's actually woven into the entire fabric of globalization that no one had talked about. And so I wrote this piece with the South China Morning Post published, and it kind of went viral. They named it again, it was not my title, the 50 Shades of White, because I kind of listed all of these things. My publisher then called me up from the US and said, Chandran, do you want to write this book? Turn it into a book. I had never thought about it. But when he said write the book, then I thought about it for a day and I said I would, because in that article, I have started touching on things that most people never think about. For instance, how white privilege is embedded into the way international business is done. That's the chapter 3. How geopolitics, as we've seen, even with how the awful war that's going on. And then I went through things that people hardly ever think about, the telling of history, fashion, the environment, the sports, etc. And it was to give people, particularly in the non-Western world, a narrative which they could make sense of, which many of us feel, but we never had a way to essentially discuss it, without being emotive and angry, analyze it. And so that was the whole point of the book.
And how does an engineer, I mean, if you think about it, right, you're kind of an engineer focused on environment, sustainability. How did that pivot come about where, that led you to kind of the study of white privilege?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm a biochemical engineer by training, and as you some may know, then I was working in London on high water systems, etc., research for nuclear reactors, etc. And I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement in London with many Africans and Zimbabweans and South Africans. So I decided to go and find out. I also decided at that stage that most of the world needed more basic technologies. And this is the same thing I think today. We're all obsessed with digital, but as I often say, 80% of the wastewater in the world is not even treated. It's called toilets and water supply systems. So I was very much development orientated, and I wanted to go and figure this out. And that was the decade of water in the 80s. So I went to Africa, I got a voluntary job, and I, as a Malaysian citizen, at that time, Malaysia is one of the few countries, to its credit, that did not recognize South Africa. So the nearest place I could get to was a country called Swaziland, which is landlocked. And I went there to build rural water supply systems and sanitation systems aligned to improving public health. And there was a cholera outbreak, et cetera. But once you get into that, and I had my engineering background, then you get into the social context of development. And when you understand development, and then in the context of Southern Africa, I got involved in understanding the class war. So many people saw the apartheid system as essentially white people oppressing black people. And I remember Malaysians who knew me at that time saying, hey, why don't those 24 million black people just get rid of all those white people? They're a minority. But they didn't understand how power works and how essentially it's consolidated in military and economic terms and all of that political system. So then I began to understand. So to answer your question, that became a journey then of development and environment. And then I came back to Asia. I was fortunate enough. I grew a large consulting company starting in Hong Kong with 10 people to about 500 people. And then I moved from the understanding of basic environment to the issue of sustainability. At that time, it was still not a concept well understood by most people. And after 15 years of consulting, much of my trajectory on sustainability moved beyond the corporate to public policy. And when you arrive at the issue of public policy, and then you look at governments, then you understand that geopolitics essentially become fundamental. And so I'll finish and say the long story is that I understood even that when it came to sustainability, there was a narrative around sustainability that was Western-centric. So if you look at climate change, much of the discussion is about what works for the West must work for China and India, but actually it doesn't. And if I take India, for example, there are 600 million Indians who do not have a proper home. Well, they can't go carbon neutral and they can't go net zero. So these are all fantasy ideas that not are rooted in the realities. And that's where then, after writing my second book on the sustainable state, which is the notion that the state will have to create the rules. This applies to Malaysia. It has meritocracy embedded. It has to have meritocracy. I came to the idea that most of our thinking is still embedded in a Western-centric world. And many of the barriers to us doing things is embedded in this, what I call the white privilege dominance of how the world works. If you don't do it my way, I will sanction you. If you don't do it our way, then you must not be thinking right. So that's how the whole thing came. So it's very much linked. And the book has one chapter around white privilege and the environment too.
Interesting. And your example in South Africa, I think is relatively interesting. Is why can't we just kick out these minorities who are holding power? And if you think about it, I think one thing that's very interesting, I think, and if you can give us a real quick sort of an overview, how is it that white privilege is maintained at this global level, right? I mean, getting it is one thing, but maintaining, like in South Africa, and enabling, and like you said, there are a lot of complexities to it. But how is it that that people are not aware or conditioned or influenced to accept this as norm? And how do they maintain this at such a global level for such a long time? I mean, what's behind it?
The first chapter of the book actually describes that. And I don't want to overstate the book, but actually no one's done this, right? So that's why the book is getting quite a lot of attention. It's also making me slightly unpopular in certain places, as you might understand. So some white guys are angry with me and they send me some hate mail, but many others understand. You know, in Africa, Middle East, Asia, they get it, right? But this is not anti-Western. But white privilege is sort of the best way to understand how, oppression and sort of domination and subjugation by Western culture globally operates and is perpetuated within and between countries with one goal in mind. The key objective is to maintain and sustain economic superiority. Now, how is it done? It's not something that is instantaneous. It has been 4 centuries. So the book talks about the subjugation of the mind. All right. So I even talk about Asians who seek whiteness. Asians who go to Australia with the name called Krishna and then they end up being called Chris. You know what I mean, right? So all of this, even and Malcolm X in the United States talked about the first act of subjugation is to straighten your hair for Black people. So if you look today at most Black women celebrities in the United States, from Oprah to Michelle, they all got straightened hair. It's 400 years. But the other thing that happens is then also the education system I talk about. So, I cite in the book, as a young boy in Malaysia, I was asked to read Shakespeare. I had no clue what this guy was talking about. He was talking about meadows and things like that. And here I am living in the tropics. It's only rainforest and, babi hutan, right? So it's a whole subjugation of the mind. Literature, you throw in the sort of Western folklore and the reference point, and then you're educated, right? So that's how, and I even argue that pop music, many of us have been brought up to reject our own cultures. So how it's perpetuated as a long history. And today then it's perpetuated because after the decolonization period, the rules of the world, the victors of the Second World War wrote the rules. And therefore, having set the rules, the gatekeepers were all Western. I argue in the book, the 4 major accounting firms in the world are all run by white guys. There is no there's no Roshan, Ali, and Lee accounting firm that could come out of Singapore. And they could. We all do maths too. So that's how. So the perpetuation of that is both mind capture, continuous media onslaught, for instance, the current anti-China sentiment, right? And everything's got to be our way. And the perpetuation of the idea that the current world order, rules-based, is the only way forward. And we all know I wasn't involved in writing the rules, nor were you, nor the Indians or the Chinese or the Africans. So that's the perpetuation, and that's the struggle at the moment. And that's where the tensions are. And that's why if you don't obey, you'll get sanctioned, because there is the grand global bargain, which allowed the United States the reserve currency. That has been weaponized in ways I think the world is tired of it. So that's how it's perpetuated. It's a constant battle at the moment. And the rise of China is a threat to that. And I'm not going to stand here and be an apologist for China. But you got to understand why is the entire Western world against China? And to your point, because for the first time in 400 years, a non-Caucasian civilization has arisen and said, hey, I'm looking at you in the eye, right? And I think that's essentially it. So the post-Western world is something that is coming, but it's the birth is now. It's troubling, but we've all got to make sure that we're not anti-Western. There are many great things coming out of the Western world and has contributed to the world we live in. But the inability to give up that power is one that will cause tensions.
I'd be interested to know what you think of white supremacy here in Southeast Asia or Malaysians. What's your take on the way we as Southeast Asia or Malaysians view white privilege? Is it something that we are aware of? Have we, you mentioned the Krishna example. Are we internalizing this? And we do know there has been some significant impact on Western culture, on our development, our culture. Yet it's a very confusing sort of time where you have so many different influences, and power struggles. What's your take on the whole white privilege here in Southeast Asia?
Apart from Thailand, Southeast Asia has been colonized by the Western world for the last 300-400 years, right? So even when you talked about, the last 100 years, etc., the disruptions, but those disruptions and the wars were in the context of still the supremacy of the West for 500 years. I mean, we fought wars for the British Empire when they were enslaving us.
Yep.
We were that stupid, right? How many Indians died fighting for the British Empire, which is enslaving them? But that's how colonization works. Today, the troops are out, but then we went into this so-called globalization area, the glorification of globalization. But the glorification of globalization was all good and well until it was disrupted by the rise of others. And then the Americans and Europeans got worried that, this is not how globalization was supposed to work. We thought it was all, all the cream was going to flow our way. And now you've got these Chinese people who want some of it, and maybe the Indians are coming. So in Southeast Asia, I mean, fortunately, we have had, relatively 50 years of peace. But you can't run away from the fact, simple things, right? I go to Bangsar shopping complex, I'm in my shorts, I'm looking like a coolie because I'm an Indian guy, I'm not dressed up. Right. I go to the cake counter because I've got someone's party, and I'm already looking at the cake. I'm talking to someone. They're wondering whether I'm from Bangladesh or whether I can afford the cake. Right. But that's all the stereotypes. And as soon as some white people come in, and I'm talking real stuff. This was 3 weeks ago. Right. As soon as some white folks come, and there's nothing wrong with them, they're entitled to come to the cake. All the attention goes towards them. Right? Because they think they got more money than I have. These might be people I actually employ, but as soon as that happens, it changes. So we have and we can't blame our people because we are subservient. I mean, we were brought up to believe that, so Mick Jagger can sing and dance. Well, he can't sing nor dance, but we were told this is how it is, right? That the best modern music is something called the Beatles. I was told to reject the Bharatanatyam or the Beijing opera or the Wayang Kulit because this is all kind of backward third world stuff, right? So we are subjugated. Our elites are much more. So where do we send our best kids? We don't send them to the best universities in Japan, India, or Beijing. We send them to the kind of flat earth society of Harvard, etc. So our elites come back. Some of them and some who are listening to me and say, well, this guy is a bit off tune here, right? But we are so subjected to this. So you get it in all areas of our work. The way you dress, the way I'm dressed too, to create respectability. But if I go in, with my sarong, it's not cool, right? So I have to look a certain way. The way I eat, the way I speak. If I speak, like a Tamilian or like a Keralite or a Malayu, then I'm not cool. I can't be on BBC. So I've learned to play the game, right? So we are very subservient, and some societies more so than others that, we can go to any conference in Southeast Asia, as you know, and they've got to be dominated by Australians, even if they're third rate. They've got to be dominated by some American celebrity who has never traveled out of Texas, but supposedly knows, and it's got to be dominated by some European. We are subservient. Like you, I speak at international conferences, and I'm always bemused by how many nobodies from the West who know nothing about this this area will be the keynote speakers, and you and me will have to follow. That's got to change. So our architecture, our intellectuals here seek legitimacy in many ways by association with Western thought leaders, etc. That's got to be dismantled, and we have to have our own standards. I'm not saying that just because you and I look like we're from this part of the world, we need to have a free pass. We have to be good, but my God, many of us are good or better and no more than some guy from Perth or London or from Houston. But that's the subservience, and and it's entrenched in the institutions.
No, one thing to consider. I'm reading a little bit is that the guy with the biggest innovation tends to lead, right? I mean, I remember about 300 years ago, I was reading a story about the beaches of Malabar where British came in with machine guns, and no matter how strong you were and no matter how many people you were, because you had invented or you had created machine guns and you shot your way through, you kind of led the pack, right? So it wasn't the strongest muscles anymore, it was the guy with the biggest guns, right? I think it calls for us, and I guess the reason we see these cracks today is places like China and saying, look, I can be more innovative, I can be more digital than you guys. And I think that's the way to fight back, right? It's also, one is to earn respect, but I think the other way is to be even more innovative, to build the platforms that beat their platforms. And you're right. I mean, our folks need to realize that good can come from us, and we need to support whichever is the best, right? And if it happens to be us, we shouldn't look down on us. But this form of white supremacy, and keying off what you were just saying about Malaysia, especially, some of these countries, they take, and I've read some of the things you've written about this, with Ketuanan and something like that. They've taken the same concept and they said we can expound that and play with it and keep power by employing it in a different sort of aspect, right? Talk us through some of those thoughts, because we see permeations of that in different countries where, yes, that's a big concept globally, but let's take the localize it to our own context and be able to play and maintain power and maintain sort of a whole of everything based on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Roshan, a very good point. I mean, to your earlier point, right, about innovation. And I won't go into all the details, but we have essentially bought into that. Someone in Silicon Valley said, we can all have helicopters. Yeah, that must be a good idea. We can deliver you pizzas with drones. So that must be a good idea. We have no ability to say, well, actually, that's a stupid idea. It doesn't work for us. And we shouldn't do that, right? So, fast foods was an innovation in the United States. And then they exported it around the world, and we thought it was a great business idea. Well, it's a sickness. It's going to kill a lot of people. We need to reject that. So innovation is also policy, but but the power of the Western media and essentially the business and the financial architecture allows this to be pushed. So in technology, for instance, we talk about innovation. And in a post-COVID world, right? So, and I'm particularly talking about digital. That's the other sort of sad thing. When we talk technology, no one talks about toilets, which is a very advanced form of technology, by the way.
Absolutely.
And they just think it's something to do with technology. So this is a perpetuation of the Silicon Valley and all of that. I'm not in any way denying the innovations there, but what do we need? In a post-COVID world, I would argue the greatest innovations going forward would be how do we finance public services such as, even in our country, in Malaysia, everyone with a toilet and a clean water supply. Now, most Malaysians will be surprised if I say, and I challenge the government or anybody in the most polite way to prove me wrong, that at least 50, and I would argue 75% of our wastewater is not treated. Now imagine, a country as rich as this in natural resource, we should be protecting all our surface waters, right? So imagine how we would do that. That's innovation, which is not to do with the digital app or to do with the drone. It's to do with essentially how do we finance socially and how do you construct that sort of social contract where people pay in the infrastructure. But when it comes to digital technology, everyone wants to talk about digital technology, but let's just look at agriculture, for instance, right? We are not even food self-sufficient in the staples, right? Now, someone somewhere in government better be waking up to the idea that food self-sufficiency is the number one thing we need to go for. And then if they get the science and we understand where the world is moving with climate and all the other stuff, they will understand that actually we need to have food self-sufficiency, which is not the American model of industrial agriculture. We need to do something different. Now that requires a huge amount of innovation, both in terms of the chemistry. We can use big data, so I'm not rejecting digitization, to look at mapping the entire country's ecosystems, and particularly arable land, denuded land, and turning it into essentially food production, not just palm oil. I'm not deriding palm oil, and how do we improve livelihoods? So all of these things are related. So that's the kind of thinking we need to have. But where do we send our best kids? We send them to the Flat Earth Society and they come back as stormtroopers and work for some investment bank and more of that BS, right? Rather than how do we use all of these things. So then everyone's talking about, grab services and things like that. That's not necessarily the future that we need. So to your point, what do we need to do? We need to look at what do we need? What does Malaysia need to look like? What does Indonesia need to look like? If we just follow the Western economic model of growth, consumption, you don't need to be a rocket scientist. And I think, I mentioned this in my first book, game over. The problem is when we were decolonized, our elite said, you guys are out, but I want to be like you. I want to be the new master. So what do we have? We have so many formulations of the economy. The East India Company left, and now we have all our GLCs, which are kind of East India companies. Same old extractive, same old method, and growth without understanding what is the quality of growth. And I'm not trying to be a hippie here or a Greenpeace guy. I'm trying to say, hey, post-COVID, what does development look like? Right? And why do we have an economy? We don't have an economy because the Americans said the economy actually thrives when you produce more. And when you produce more, the pie grows larger and somehow it trickles down. Well, we're finding out that the gravy is so thick, it doesn't trickle, right? And so why do we have an economy? We have an economy so that the majority of Malaysians will not live lives of drudgery and pain. And that is happening, and it will become wider. So the best minds should innovate. So what is the economy for? And it's not just simply to have another car industry. That's old thinking.
No, and I think it's spot on. I honestly, personally, also feel we need to have a new narrative and think about, how we can look at ourselves, in 20 years, 30 years. If not, we're straight. We keep going back to this vision 2020, developed nation, and now it's 50 and whatever, say 80. Nothing's going to change. But to your point, when the colonization ended, right, when the British Empire let go and the Dutch let the Indonesians go and so on, we replaced that with a new form of white supremacy, right? I mean, you call it whatever you want. So when we went to decouple, right, there's two big areas, right? One is this global white supremacist narrative, but you also have this local flavored narrative, whether it's Ketuhanan, like whatever it is, right? And every country has a different form of it to some extent, right? Most developing countries. How does one decouple from all these different narratives? Because you got the local one and also this global narrative, right? Where do you start?
I think, there's the global narrative, which is, in my book, I argue we need to decouple. And that doesn't mean becoming unglobalized, etc. But the suggestion that somehow globalization is a panacea for all our ills, I hope has been, punctured by what happened during the COVID, right? So firstly, you have to be self-sufficient. The suggestion that somehow I can import rice from somewhere else because we're going to be this manufacturing digital hub, when you should actually be growing your own rice and essentially saving yourselves a lot of foreign currencies. That's just common sense, right? So deflate that, get onto this page and say, what is it that we need to do? What does our country look like? Then the other point that's challenging, and you're talking about decoupling, is how the globalized sort of control, what I call the gatekeepers in the entire system, has essentially bled into all corners of the world. I think 1MDB is like, I'm not going to talk about the corruption, but 1MDB is a classic example that most Malaysians woke up to after the fact to realize how insidious is it. And now as all the dirt comes out in the linen, well, I mean, there's some dirt I didn't want to know about, but there's stuff coming out that we're thinking, oh my God, this was 15 years ago. Malaysia was so interconnected into this. Why? All the gatekeepers of that system were here. And as you will know, every one of the big four was somehow involved in the shenanigans of this. Every one of the big fours has been in big four accounting firms have been involved in all of this. The major consulting firms, for instance, from the McKinseys to the BCG, have a feeding frenzy in Malaysia. I know those guys, right? Because they have essentially said, you guys know nothing, we will tell you. And as soon as our GLCs want a strategy, which no one's going to read, they just get one of those guys to say, can you give us a blue ocean thing or a brown earth strategy or whatever. And so they're all very
don't forget
much
the purple. Don't forget the purple cow. Sometimes
the purple cow, whatever you want, right? And we'll put a bit of wayang kulit in it, but it'll all be coming from some village called Boston or some strange place called Silicon Valley or some place called London. But none of it will be local. But we'll have local guys working on it, and they are actually allies of the white privilege. They don't even know it. Now, so to decouple it, you really need to understand how the perpetuation of this carries on. So in Malaysia, therefore, that privilege issue is also in understanding, why do people want power, right? Why does white privilege exist? And as I said earlier, it's one sole goal. And this I learned in Africa, in Southern Africa. It is essentially economic power. That's why people are not racist because they just don't like the color of your skin, but they see you as essentially a barrier to their ability to control resources, whether it was the Belgians going to Congo, and then they denigrate them, because by denigrating them, they allow themselves to come to terms with the fact that these people are inferior. Therefore, by mistreating them or even displacing them, I've not actually done a bad thing, right? And so it's perpetuated and perpetuated. And in our country, what's happened is our elites, and particularly the elites, and led, unfortunately, by our Malay political elites, are doing the same thing at a local level that what the supremacists of what I call the global white privilege do. They want economic power. They want to be the rent seekers of the economy. They don't want meritocracy. And they want to say, we are in charge. And therefore, we have to now decouple the idea that the elites, political system, unfortunately, led by our Malay politicians, and I'm not saying that they don't have allies in the Indian community or Chinese community, but the super predator is the Malay politician. And what do they want? I mean, they're all our friends. They're not anti-Indian or anti-Chinese. They all have friends. Some of them are married to them, we know that. But what they want is economic power. And the way they get economic power is by saying there's an enemy, and these other people might take over. This is our country. Well, that is actually all lies. It's a bit like Donald Trump saying to Black people in the United States, if you don't like it here, go back to Africa, right? So it's a bit like saying to me in Malaysia, hey, you're Indian. This is our country, the Malays. And I keep reminding them, as you probably know, during an interview with Astro last year, which unfortunately Astro took down. So if the Astro bosses are listening, be brave. People want to hear this stuff. I was not anti-Malay or anti-anything. I just said, actually, Malaysia is my country. I have equal rights to other Indians, Chinese, and the Malay. And no one can tell me I don't have equal rights. This is a fact. This is any law. So the supremacist attitude of our Ketuanan Melayu is something archaic. And I think this is also part of the decoupling that will take place. And it also affects our countries in very bad ways, because now we don't have meritocracy, we have institutional racism, and the economy will eventually falter. It'll get worse unless we do this too. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah,
but it's the same. And the allies of that system, the Western, what can I say, institutions, they have no qualms about it. I can give you many examples of serving the Ketuanan Melayu, right? Because he says, hey, you're my ally too. And they all go to the same schools and come back, but they have no qualms about serving them. We have a problem with that. And that's part of that complex issue of racism and privilege in Malaysia.
Yeah. It's been an engaging and enthralling conversation. Always is, having this conversation with you. If you were to wrap it up and give some advice to leaders, right? One is that issue you talk about, decoupling white supremacy in our own communities, and also this secondary layer of what sort of other advice would you give to our current leaders to contribute and enable us to move to that new era, to that new thinking, to that new way where we are as equal citizens of this world to these others who have kind of claimed supremacy?
Well, I think firstly, in terms of at the global level, the reason I wrote the book, and last week I was interviewed by ABC. 2 months ago, I was interviewed for the BBC. My first thing is to say that the inevitability of post-Western world equity is coming. The question is, how painful is it going to be? How painful is it going to be that the Western world, led by the United States, is going to say, no way, Jack, and therefore we're going to put all the barriers. But it's coming. Right now it looks like it's the Chinese front, but the Indian front is coming, the ASEAN front is coming, the African front is coming. It's coming. So we don't want it to be painful. So my advice usually to Western leaders is, it's coming. I feel your pain, but I don't condone it. Get used to it. But it's in your interest to accept that you cannot maintain this sort of primacy and position as the gatekeepers. You have to understand, in a more multipolar world, plurality is the future, right? So don't demonize others. In our part of the world, I think firstly, question everything. Take the best of both worlds. And finally, I want to say, so in Malaysian context, we at the Global Institute will be producing, in the final stages of producing a report. It's called NEP, and it stands for Now Everyone Prospers, the best of both worlds, right?
Nice.
And the idea is to also leverage what's going on in the world. Malaysia doesn't sit in isolation. And I think the elite, Ketuanan Melayu, the supremacists in this country do not have a clue what is happening in the world. The change is coming. And if they hang on to archaic, racist, institutional, they'll be left behind. They're being left behind, but the majority of the Islamic world as well. So in our part of the world, think deep. We need to build better institutions. We need to take the best of both worlds. And in terms of educating our people, we need them to have critical thinking. So we should not be just saying, hey, the Harvard Business School and MIT said this, therefore we should follow that. We should look at everything. And, I'll leave you with this idea that I've always said, for instance, when I speak in the United States and they all talk about sustainability and climate, and I say to them, you guys have no idea what sustainability is, because you can't, as an American president, stand and say car ownership isn't a human right. And it isn't. In our part of the world, so as crowded as we are, and we know most of our cities are overrun, this idea that the automotive industry has a free ride and essentially the basis for industrialization is 100 years old. So today, what we need to say is car ownership is not a human right, mobility is. Therefore, what we do, if the car industry has to be essentially, slightly contained, it has to do because we would put public and common good ahead of essentially a particular industry. So that's the kind of innovations that we need to think about, and not follow deluded people like Elon Musk, etc. Because planet Earth is where we are, and we're not going to the moon.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We've been speaking to Chandran Nair, the author of a new book called Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World. With that, thank you so much, Chandran. We will catch you next time. Have a great one, everybody. Bye-bye.